Well, if you're watching this and you're under the age of 21, you might be aware that anthropologists have labelled your generation Generation Z. And one of the hallmarks of Generation Z is said to be that you are the most secular generation alive in the Western world today. In fact, a bit of research recently carried out by the Barna Group showed that someone from Generation Z is twice as likely to be an atheist than someone from another generation alive today in the Western world. And they carried out a ton of research as to why that is, and here is the top reason as to why someone from Generation Z, stereotypically, is more likely to be secular than someone else. The top reason was this, that they struggle to believe that there really could be a God in heaven when there's so much suffering in the world. How could there really be a God in heaven, someone who's in control, someone who says to love people, yet at the same time there's so much suffering in the world? In other words, how could there be a God when life really doesn't make sense? And perhaps you're watching this and you're not a professing atheist, but actually you're a professing Christian, but that too is a question that you find yourself having. How can there be a God, a loving God, an almighty God, a powerful God, when there's so much suffering in the world and life doesn't really make sense? And perhaps it leads you to doubt this God that you worship. And I think that's a question that perhaps even the first hearers of the book of Daniel themselves were asking. Because just like us, they were going through a rather unique period of history. Of course, they weren't going through a COVID-19 outbreak, but they were going through something perhaps even more devastating. They had found that their land, Jerusalem, had been besieged by the Babylonians. And so these Babylonians were coming into their culture. They were ripping families apart. They were taking people and forcing them to be a part of the Babylonian culture. And no doubt they were suffering harsh oppression under Babylonian rule. And can you imagine being one of these Israelites being forced into exile against your will, separated from your family, moved to a new culture? At that moment, life most definitely doesn't make sense. And no doubt you've got a couple of questions, don't you? Is God really on the throne? Is God really who he says he is in the scriptures? And as we think about life when it doesn't make sense and the questions that it prompts in our mind, I think Daniel chapter 1 teaches us and reminds us of some great home truths about who God is and what God is like even when life doesn't make sense. Notice the first one with me, the first home truth that we see in Daniel chapter 1, and it's this: when life doesn't make sense, God is not caught by surprise. Look with me from verse 1 and 2. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. These first two verses really just remind us of the context of this book of Daniel, how these Israelites have been taken into captivity from the Babylonians. And this deportation really took place in 3 waves. And Daniel chapter 1 gives us a snapshot of this first wave of exile. And when tragic things like this happen, we as humans are often rocked and we're shocked. And quite often because we are surprised, we somehow think that God is surprised, don't we? Because we are caught off guard by events like this happening in our world, quite often we tend to think that even God is caught off guard by these events taking place in our world. But actually what these opening 2 verses helpfully remind us of is this: God is not caught by surprise. In fact, he knew that this was happening, and he knew that this was going to happen. You see, these first 2 verses give us a really helpful timeline of when these events in Daniel chapter 1 are actually taking place. You'll notice what it says in verse 1. It says, these events are taking place in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim the king. You see, this marks Daniel chapter 1 at about 605 BC. And that's really helpful and really significant for you and I as we read this passage, because it reminds us that if we were reading the Bible chronologically, we would actually have expected and known that this moment was going to happen. Why? Because God had warned that this would happen through his prophets many, many times. In fact, the people of Israel in this story, they should have known that this was going to happen because God had told them many times before through the prophets. Let me give you just one example of a prophet telling and warning the people of Israel that this day was coming. This prophecy comes from Isaiah chapter 39, verses 6 and 7, 100 years before Daniel chapter 1. Here's what the prophet Isaiah warns. He says, behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which are your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the place of the king of Babylon. When life doesn't make sense for you and I, it is confusing and it is startling. But God is not caught off guard. God is not caught by surprise. Did COVID-19 catch us as humans by surprise? Absolutely. Did it catch God by surprise? Absolutely not. Did the news that your exams have been cancelled catch you by surprise? Absolutely. Did it catch God by surprise? No. He knew back in January when you were praying to him, stressed out of your head about the thought of exams in May. Even back then, he knew what was going to happen. Were you surprised when you found out that all your camps and teams and other activities this summer were cancelled? Yeah, you were totally surprised. Was God? No. In fact, he knew back in January when you were filling out the application form that this was going to happen. God is not caught by surprise when anything happens in this world which doesn't make sense to us, and so it shouldn't be a reason or an excuse for you to doubt his existence. When life doesn't make sense, God is not caught by surprise. But notice secondly, when life doesn't make sense, we learn from Daniel chapter 1 that God's mission is not hindered. God's mission is not hindered. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this chapter and what we read within it. We're introduced to a guy called Daniel and his three friends, four guys who, if you're a teenager, they're probably no older than you. And these are people from Jerusalem, but they're brought by the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, to be enrolled in a special Babylonian training program. And King Nebuchadnezzar really has a clever plan. He acknowledges that these four Israelites are very clever, they're very strong, they're kind of natural born leaders. And so if we can force them to be assimilated into the Babylonian culture, then all the other Israelites will follow. It's a very, very clever plan from King Nebuchadnezzar. And so you can see in verses 5 to 7 that King Nebuchadnezzar tries to make these boys change a number of things. Firstly, you can see that they were forced to change their diet, verse 5a, to enroll in a Babylonian diet. Secondly, they were forced to change their education, verse 5b. They were to enroll on a Babylonian education. And then thirdly, they were told to change their names in verse 7. So the boys are asked to change three things, and as you read through the chapter, it's interesting that two of the changes that are proposed by King Nebuchadnezzar, the boys accept, but one of the changes the boys reject. They say, we're happy to change our names, we're happy to enroll on this Babylonian training program, but they refuse to eat the king's meat or drink the king's wine. Isn't that strange? Why would they refuse to eat the king's meat or drink the king's wine? I think we're given some sort of a hint at the very least in verse 8. Look at verse 8 with me. It says, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Daniel did not want to defile himself or make himself unclean. You see, in the Old Testament, where Daniel is living and under the Old Covenant, there were some pretty strict food laws for the people of God, particularly when it came to eating foods which had been dedicated to false gods. Eating the food that had been dedicated to false gods was to associate yourself with the false god that the foods had been dedicated to. And so Daniel and his friends say, no, we will not eat this food from the king. That will be a violation of our faith in the true God, Yahweh. And so they say no, and this is a gutsy move from Daniel and his friends, a seriously gutsy move. In fact, you can see in verse 10 that this chief of eunuchs says to Daniel, I fear my lord the king. This chief of eunuchs is almost pleading with Daniel and the boys to go through with what King Nebuchadnezzar is suggesting, because he knows what King Nebuchadnezzar is like. He takes no prisoners. He doesn't respond well to people directly ignoring his commands. If this chief of eunuchs was to go back to King Nebuchadnezzar and even say, well, the boys accepted most of what you said, they just rejected a little bit. He knows that King Nebuchadnezzar would try and end the lives not just of the boys, but of himself. But notice the key phrase in verse 9. Look at verse 9 with me. It says, but God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of eunuchs. See, even in the midst of the confusion and the chaos, God is able to sovereignly intervene into the middle of the confusion and the chaos and to fulfill his purposes, to protect his people and to fulfill his mission. And so even when life doesn't make sense, why is God's mission not hindered? Because God's power is not thwarted. Even when life doesn't make sense, God is able to do what only God can do. And so because of that, because God granted favour to Daniel and his friends, to this chief of eunuchs, he happily goes along with this crazy little plan that Daniel's about to suggest. You can read about that plan in verses 12 to 14. Daniel effectively says to the chief of eunuchs, put us on a diet of merely vegetables and water for 10 days. And after those 10 days, compare us to the other guys, the guys who happily enrolled in King Nebuchadnezzar's diet regime. And let's see who's buffer, let's see who's stronger. Us on merely vegetables and water for 10 days, or those guys on a high protein diet. Who's going to be buffer? And look at the outcome in verses 15 and 16. It says, at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they, Daniel and his friends, were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. You don't need to be an expert in diet programs to know that this one breaks all the rules, doesn't it? That you could, A, gain fat and muscle from just eating vegetables and drinking water, but B, that you could do so in such a short period of time, just 10 days. Yet it's just another example of divine intervention, God flexing his muscles and miraculously intervening in order to fulfill his mission. And so even when life doesn't make sense, God's mission is not hindered because his power is not thwarted. And this amazing progress of these boys just soars even higher towards the end of the chapter, when we discovered that not only do they outdo their other boys on the program merely on their physical appearance, but in just about every other area as well. Look with me from verse 20, which says, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of him, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. Even in the midst of these strange times for God's people, God was able and willing to use his people. His mission will continue. And you know, the same is exactly true for you, and perhaps it's even more true for you as a New Testament Christian living in the New Covenant and living on this side of the cross. Living in this side of history after Jesus' moment on the cross where Satan suffered an ultimate blow, a fatal blow, that God is willing and able to use you to fulfill his purposes and accomplish his mission. And so that provokes me to ask the question of you. In these strange times, God wants to and is willing and able to use you. In fact, we might be right in saying that particularly in these strange times, God is willing and able to use someone like you. And so let me offer you a few practical ways in which God may be wishing to use you to fulfill his mission and purposes in our world right now. Firstly, perhaps it's in the strange assurance that you have in these days. You know, everyone is very worried about their future right now and about the global outcome of all this. And as a Christian, you don't have the same cause for concern because you know who holds the future. And so maybe this strange assurance that you have in these days is your witness in these days. But maybe it's not the strange assurance that you have. Maybe secondly, it's your fervency in prayer. Maybe it's prayer for our leaders. Maybe it's prayer for your family. Maybe it's prayer for those who you love who don't know Christ. Maybe in these strange days, God is provoking you to pray more than you usually would and with greater intensity and passion and vigor than you usually have. Maybe God is wanting to use you in your prayer life. Or maybe thirdly, it's God wants to use you in your practical assistance. Something as basic as doing someone's shopping, sending someone a card, dropping someone a text message. Maybe in these days, God is using you to fulfill his purposes through your practical help. And so whatever it looks like for you, know that God's mission is not hindered in these days. God has promised that his gospel will prevail, and as we were reminded in point 1, God knew when he made that promise that this day was coming, this strange season in 2020. And so when life doesn't make sense, God is not caught by surprise. God's mission is not hindered. Thirdly, though, when life does not make sense, God has not lost control. You might be listening to this and you think to yourself, okay, Matthew, I can go with you so far in those first 2 points. Sure, God isn't surprised by strange events. He knows the future. You might even concede, secondly, that God will ultimately bring about his plans and he will bring them to fruition and his mission won't be hindered. But we can't surely say that God's really in control of all these things. We can't say that God's really in control from all these events from start to finish. Surely that's a bit too far. Because if we're totally honest, we tend to view God kind of just like us, but bigger. And so when something terrible like an invasion in Jerusalem or COVID-19 strikes, we kind of just think that God is reactive like we are, just kind of responding to the emergency as it comes. And so in the same way, when we think of Daniel, we kind of think, well, God will work in and through Daniel and his friends, but it's always just kind of in response to what the Babylonians have done. We kind of look at the chapter in human terms and we see it as, well, the people of Israel were just invaded by a more powerful army, the army of Babylon, and so they won. But that's not the case. God's not reactive. No, he is sovereignly working and in control even of the Babylonian army. God is in control even of the enemy. And this is something which is shown for us in this chapter by a phrase which is repeated 3 times in the chapter. This phrase is a literary device used by the author so that you and I, as readers of Daniel chapter 1, would know that at every juncture of this story, God is in complete control. For every character in this story, God is in complete control. For every movement in the story, whether we might think that it's for good or for bad, God is ultimately in control, and it only happened because God allowed it to happen. The phrase is this: the Lord gave, or God gave. It comes up at every strategic juncture of the passage. Firstly in verse 2, then in verse 9, and then in verse 17. Look at them with me. Firstly in verse 2. It says this: the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the land. Verse 9, and God gave Daniel favour and compassion in the sight of his chief of eunuchs. Verse 17, as for those 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Why did everything in the story of Daniel chapter 1 happen, whether for good or for evil? Because ultimately it was God who gave them the ability to do it. God was in control of every single movement in chapter 1 of the book of Daniel. Nothing happened that somehow escaped his sovereign control. God is not reactive. Isaiah chapter 40 says, what are the nations before God? They are nothing before them. You see, God moves nations around our world the same way and with the same ease that you would move peas around your dinner plate. God does not respond to the Babylonians. In God's strange providence, the Babylonians were only able to even invade Jerusalem in the first place because God permitted it and God controlled it. In the same way, God does not respond to coronavirus. God does not respond to your exam cancellation. God is not just responding to your messed up summer plans. God is not just responding or reacting to your loss of income through your job. No, God is not reactive. The whole time he is on the throne and the whole time he has remained the sovereign king who permits everything to fulfill his mission and to accomplish his purposes. And so when life doesn't make sense, God is not caught by surprise, God's mission is not hindered, and God has not lost control.